All right, awesome. Thanks, Paul. So I'm kind of double dipping here, both organizing this meetup with Paul, but also presenting along with so the other people on the saveDAI team. So I'm going to say a few words and then try to get out of the way. Let Ksenia and Doug handle most of this. But we are saveDAI, and we're super happy to be here. So let me talk a little bit about what saveDAI is. I'll just do a quick introduction and then hand it over to Doug and then Ksenia to talk about some other things, and then I'll be back at some point to talk a little more. So like a little bit of history. About, I don't know how long this is ago now, my month math is bad right now, but last August, I kind of had this thought that I would love to see a tokenized version of DAI that has both interest bearing capabilities as well as insurance coverage. So if you guys are familiar with Compound, they have the saveDAI token that you get when you deposit into Compound. I wanted to see something like Nexus Mutual create a tokenized version of that. So this is something I kind of put out there on Twitter, and it seemed to get a little traction. And so it's something that stuck in my head for a while. So when it came time to go to ETH Denver, I was thinking about that, and all of a sudden, Open Protocol was announced just a few days before. We'll talk a little bit more about Open Protocol in a sec. But I met Ksenia at ETH Denver, and then we continued out with our hack. And I don't know what it was, like 2 or 3 weeks later, we brought Doug in to help out and join the team. So the team is right now, it's 3 of us. We've gotten a little bit of help from a few other folks, but it's been 3 of us for now, and it's kind of a side gig for all of us, but it's been super fun. So what is saveDAI, and what are we trying to do? There's probably a few different ways to think about it, but the easiest or the simplest way is a really easy way to open an insured high interest savings account. So what do we mean by that? So traditional savings account, I'm sure you guys are all familiar with those. And you may be familiar with the newer concept of a DeFi savings account. So Compound saveDAI is effectively a DeFi savings account. You deposit your DAI, you get back a representation of that deposit, and you can earn interest. Both traditional and DeFi, you can earn interest. DeFi savings accounts or interest rates are typically a little higher, although the environment is a little bit depressed right now. Where things start to really differ is in the risk involved. A traditional savings account has got, at least in the United States, FDIC insurance, or in other countries, other forms of deposit insurance. So if there's a run on the bank, you're guaranteed to get your money back up to a certain amount. But in DeFi, that's just not at all the case right now. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. The protocol can get hacked. There could be some sort of adverse financial event. As some of these protocols like Compound start adding in governance components, there might be some sort of issue with governance. It could be captured in some way, and potentially your money could go fly away. On the other hand, DeFi savings accounts are super easy to open or just get started, and you can move your money wherever you'd like. You're not beholden to any single bank or anything like that. So what saveDAI is trying to do is be the best of both of those things. And really where we're focusing on is in the difference between is here in the second row in risk. So how are we doing that? So let's talk about the components of saveDAI for a second. So we already talked about saveDAI. saveDAI, where you're depositing your DAI into Compound, and saveDAI is essentially a representation of the DAI inside of Compound that is earning interest. So you can think about saveDAI as an interest-bearing digital dollar. On the other side is OCDAI. OCDAI is, you can think about it as insurance from the Open Protocol. The Open Protocol is an options protocol. So actually, in reality, what OCDAI is a protective put option, which basically says that if you own that, it means you have the right to sell your saveDAI at some point in the future before that option expires for a certain amount of ETH. And in this case, that is an amount of ETH roughly equivalent to your original deposit, which means that it acts roughly like a deposit insurance. So these two things exist. We're not really changing what these two things are. Today you can go and get saveDAI, you can go and get saveDAI. What saveDAI is basically just a wrapper around those two. We're trying to make it as easy as possible to get both of those things together into a single asset. And we like to talk about that kind of thing as a self-insured asset, which we think is kind of a new concept that is only possible on a blockchain like Ethereum. And we think that's pretty cool. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that might mean in the future. So with that, I think we're going to get into a lot more detail, take a look at some of the technical components. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Doug.
Cool. Thanks, Spencer. Yeah, so saveDAI at a high level really has three core pieces of functionality, and we'll kind of drill down into these in a moment. But at a high level, you can mint saveDAI, right? You can exercise insurance on your saveDAI, or you can withdraw from the saveDAI contract. And we have a few different ways in which you can do that, which we'll speak to more in a moment. Next slide. So as far as the mint function here, what we're doing as far as the interface goes is we accept an argument that specifies the amount of saveDAI tokens an individual would like to mint, and then we return a Boolean to represent if the transaction was successfully executed. Next slide. So kind of taking a look at the code itself and kind of step by step what's happening. So the first thing we do is we calculate what the cost of saveDAI and saveDAI will be that is necessary to mint that given amount of saveDAI tokens that the user is requesting. Upon identifying that cost that will be incurred, we then transfer the DAI needed to mint the saveDAI tokens from the message sender and use it to mint the saveDAI from Compound. And then also we go ahead and buy the saveDAI from Uniswap. And then upon completing those transactions, we go ahead and mint the same amount of saveDAI tokens for message sender. So our contract is holding on to that saveDAI and saveDAI on behalf of message sender, but then sending those saveDAI tokens to them. Next slide. Next on to exercise insurance. So this function accepts the amount of saveDAI tokens on which to exercise insurance, as well as provides an array of addresses, which are these vaults, which contain ETH, and we'll talk more about these in a moment. It's kind of like a piece of Opens protocol, but these vaults of which will withdraw that ETH from in order to sufficiently exercise insurance on behalf of the message sender. So the way Open works, and Spencer was getting into it, but just kind of take it a step further, it operates as a two-sided marketplace in that users can obtain coverage, i.e. O tokens, and providers can then earn money by providing coverage, right? So in order to provide coverage, a user has to lock up ETH as collateral. And I believe Open's collateralization ratio is 140%. I'd have to double check that, but I think it's around that. Yeah. And then once providers have done that, right, they've locked up their ETH in these vaults as collateral, they receive O tokens in return, and then they have two options as far as how they can make money. They can either sell that insurance, those O tokens, to buyers on Uniswap and earn premiums, or they can add those O tokens to the Uniswap pool and earn transaction fees from other trading activity that's taking place. It's also worth noting too, and I thought this was pretty cool, in that if you're providing insurance, you can close your position at any time. All you need to do is buy back your O tokens and return them to the vault, and then you can retrieve that ETH collateral that you initially put in there. So at a high level, that's how that open marketplace is operating. Next slide. So as far as our exercising insurance function and kind of the logic behind it, the first thing we have to do is we have to approve Open's OCDAI contract and give it permission to spend CDAI and OCDAI on behalf of our saveDAI contract. And the reason we have to do this is because within Open's exercise function, the way it works is that, so after a user exercises their insurance option and receives ETH from those vaults that we mentioned earlier, the providers then in turn receive the amount of OCDAI and CDAI from the saveDAI contract. And so that way they can liquidate those items if they want to. If something really bad happened and that individual is exercising insurance because something really bad happened with Compound or something else, then those tokens are probably less valuable, right? But they can still at least liquidate those and get back some capital in return. So it's not a total loss. But after that approval, then we withdraw the ETH from the vault addresses provided in that array to accommodate the user's desire to exercise their insurance. And that ETH is then sent back to the message sender, and the corresponding amount of CDAI and OCDAI are sent to the insurance provider. And then lastly, of course, we go ahead and burn that amount of saveDAI tokens. Next slide. Cool. So with withdrawal, we have a few different flavors for withdrawal. So users can either, they have the option to withdraw both their asset, i.e. CDAI, and O tokens, i.e. OCDAI, or they have the option to withdraw just their asset, i.e. just their CDAI tokens. Or lastly, they have the option to withdraw their underlying DAI asset. And we'll kind of drill into these in a moment as well. Next slide. So as far as the interface goes for the withdraw for asset and O tokens function, we of course accept an amount of saveDAI tokens that a user would like to unbundle in return for CDAI and OCDAI. And then next slide. So the first thing that we'll do is we'll check and make sure that insurance coverage hasn't expired yet. And if it hasn't, then we'll go ahead and send message sender back the amount of CDAI and OCDAI that they've requested. Conversely, if it has expired, we can only send back the CDAI, right? That OCDAI is no longer of value any longer. So we just send them back the CDAI. And then of course, after transferring those tokens, we go ahead and burn the corresponding amount of saveDAI tokens. Next slide. Now, if we're just withdrawing for the asset, i.e. the CDAI, what we do here is, well, as far as the interface goes, we accept the amount argument of which we want to unbundle for CDAI. Next slide. And so the first thing we'll do, again, we'll similarly, we'll check to see if insurance has expired. Though unlike withdraw for asset no tokens, if insurance has expired, we're going to go ahead and revert right away. If it hasn't expired, what we'll do is we will swap the amount of OCDAI on Uniswap for DAI. And then we'll use that new DAI that we've obtained and use it to buy more CDAI. And then finally, what we'll do is send the initial amount of CDAI as well as that newly amount of CDAI. We'll send the sum of that to the message sender. And then, of course, go ahead and burn the corresponding amount of saveDAI tokens. Next slide. And then lastly, as far as the interface goes for the withdraw for underlying asset, this is very similar to withdraw for asset, though we're talking about the underlying asset of DAI in this case, right? So next slide. So the first thing we'll do is, again, we'll check to see if insurance has expired. If it has, we'll revert. If it hasn't, we'll go ahead and redeem DAI for the specified amount of CDAI through Compound. And then we'll swap out the amount of OCDAI for DAI on Uniswap, and then transfer that total sum of DAI back to message sender. So very similar to withdraw for asset, but instead it's all for the underlying DAI asset that the user is withdrawing. And with that, I think I will hand things off to Ksenia.
Cool, thanks, Doug. Okay, so I'm just gonna go over some of the challenges we faced when working on this project. I have 3 to go over. There was definitely a lot more. It's kind of funny what started as a weekend hackathon project has turned into months of work. So yeah, just highlighting a couple of these challenges. The first one is the compound minting rounding issue, which drove us crazy for a couple weeks there. Like Doug mentioned, in our mint function, we need to calculate the amount of DAI needed to mint saveDAI tokens as well as to buy the saveDAI tokens. And we know that we want to mint, we're passing in the amount of saveDAI that we want to mint. And we know that we also want to mint that same amount of saveDAI and buy that same amount of saveDAI. So the compound mint function works where a user deposits DAI. That DAI amount is divided by the compound exchange rate, and that gives you your amount of saveDAI tokens. So using basic math, we know to calculate the DAI needed, we can just take the amount of saveDAI that we want to mint and multiply it by the exchange rate. So that's what we're doing inside of we have an internal function that's doing that math. Then we take that DAI amount that we've calculated and we transfer it from the user's wallet, of course. And then we pass that into the compound mint function to go ahead and mint the saveDAI. Then we take a look at the saveDAI that's actually been minted, and it's always the amount of saveDAI that we want to mint minus 1. So every single time it's just missing that one digit at the very end. So we were racking our brain to figure out if we were doing something wrong. Compound actually has a couple. They have 2 exchange rates in their protocol, so we tried both. Turns out it's a common thing. It's just a rounding issue. And initially we decided to just say, okay, it's just off by one digit to the user. They're not even going to be able to notice. We just know to test that it'll always be off by 1. We actually had someone from the Ethereum Foundation do a code review, and he said that it's a known issue and he would send us some code to help fix it. And essentially what that code is doing is just subtracting 1 when we do that calculation. So yeah, it drove us crazy, but we were able to solve it by just subtracting that 1. Next slide.
Ksenia, we've got a question from Vishal.
Yep.
Where is that exchange rate coming from?
That's the compound protocol. It's like, I can't remember what the formula is, but it's based on the supply and demand of saveDAI in a compound. So you can just call that function on the compound protocol and it gives you the exchange rate. Next slide. Testing, yes. So from the very beginning, when we started writing the Solidity code, obviously if anyone writes Solidity code, you know that you have to write unit tests in order to be able to test the code. And because we're interacting with so many protocols, we knew that running a local Ganache blockchain would be difficult, or painful, I should say, because we'd have to deploy the Uniswap factory and exchange. We'd have to deploy DAI. We'd have to mint DAI for our wallets. We'd have to set up the Uniswap exchange contract for DAI and saveDAI. We'd have to deploy Open Options Factory. We'd have to create, actually mint those saveDAI tokens by, calling a function on the Open protocol and depositing ETH as collateral. So all of these are steps that we would need to write out before we could actually start interacting with our functions. So we found a less painful way of testing, which is running a forked mainnet using Ganache. I don't know if anyone's ever used this, but it was actually really, really useful. Essentially, it's a feature with Ganache CLI. You run the Ganache CLI command with this -f, and then you point to a node. So we used Infura, set up a project. And that basically just gives you a fork of the mainnet up to the point that you're forking. And then all of these accounts you see -- unlock, these are all of the accounts that we needed to interact with on mainnet. So the Uniswap factory, Uniswap exchange DAI, all of these contracts that we don't have ownership of or have private keys of, you can use this -- unlock command and interact with those contracts basically. So everything's already set up, obviously, because it's on mainnet, so we could use all of those contract balances. We found a user wallet that had like 1 million DAI or something in their wallet, and we're unlocking their user wallet, so we can use their user wallet to, you know, test our mint function essentially. And then next slide. Oh, and this one is, I mean, this one isn't a huge challenge, but I'm sure like other developers understand or can empathize with this. Why is naming so hard? It's like really hard to find the perfect function or variable names. We had several conversations about this, and we were trying to decide whether to go generic versus specific. So we started with very specific names. Remove insurance, remove and sell insurance for saveDAI, remove and sell insurance for DAI, get cost of saveDAI, get cost of saveDAI. And after a few conversations, we decided to switch those to use more generic naming conventions. And that's mainly to do with our future plans, which we'll talk about in a moment. So yeah, remove insurance got turned to withdraw for asset and O tokens, withdraw for asset, withdraw for underlying asset, and then get cost of asset and get cost of O token. And next slide. Oh, and this is you, Spencer.
All right, cool. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to click this image, and it's going to, what we're going to do is we're going to walk through, we have a Figma prototype. Thought we would show you guys how we're thinking about what the front end or the user interface is going to look like. It's currently in development. So we, in theory, could show you kind of a partly done, like a live version. My phone wanted to join the conversation. We could show you a partly done version, but instead I think we're just going to show you the prototype to show you how like most of the interactions will work. But before I do that, I just wanted to pause and see if anybody had any questions about anything we've talked about so far. There's one additional one in the chat that I'll get to in a second, but does anybody have any questions, or Paul, have we gotten any in the Discord?
I put a couple in the Discord, but they can wait till the end. I don't think there's any from anyone else yet. And the link to the Discord is in the Zoom chat.
I think so. The one in the Zoom chat is, how will proof of stake once we move to ETH2 affect this project? So the answer to that is probably not a ton, or at least not very differently from any other project or contract or protocol. One, probably the cop-out answer is that is going to happen, that likely is going to happen in a meaningful way after the point at which the insurance for the first version of saveDAI expires. So the life of the contract that we're writing now is going to be shorter than the point at which, is going to end by the point at which proof of stake or anything like sharding or anything like that has any sort of impact. There's a longer answer, but I'll leave it there for now. Maybe after in the Hangout session we can get more into it. All right, so let's see if this link works. Sweet. I'm going to do this because I kind of mocked up a browser to put MetaMask in there. So here we go. Oh, this is faded because I was messing around and I forgot to unmess around. So this is just the home page, or the beginning of the app. One thing that we are trying to be very careful with is to not make any kind of promises, or to in fact like go the other direction, and be very careful with what we tell users. The code has not been audited. Even when we first launch, likely the code will not have been completely fully audited at that point. And so we're thinking about ways to mitigate that and try to take a more of a phased approach to our launch. That's an interesting topic that we could probably discuss at greater length at some other point. But I guess the first thing that I want to point out is that we're trying to show, like, everything we're doing is trying to make things easier on our users. Basically, the whole point of saveDAI is to make something that already exists easier. You can already get CDAI, you can already get OCDAI. So we're not adding anything new. It's basically a UX project. So that's where a lot of our focus is, in addition to security. So we're trying to make it clear what is going on and where the different things come from. So in this case, if we were to deposit 100 DAI into saveDAI, this is not what happened today. This is probably as of like a few months ago, when the compound DAI interest rate was more like 5%. But you might expect a premium that you have to pay for the insurance, basically the cost of the OCDAI, to come in at around 2% of your deposit. And so the difference between those two then would be around 3%, which is your the insured interest rate, or the covered interest rate. The current version of OCDAI, that expires February 10th, 2021. It was launched originally on February 10th, 2020. At that point, we'll talk about this in a little bit. We'll need to do something to renew. There's the concept with OCDAI or open options or the insurance from open of amount insured or max loss. This is basically, you could think of this almost like a deductible. And it's there to optimize the two-sided market for those options. So in options terms, is putting the strike price slightly out of the money, which has a lot of benefits, some of which I don't understand. But that basically means we have to take from open the amount that is actually getting covered. And you can see here that of our 100 DAI, 8 is actually not going to get covered, only about 90 is. And the reason that's 8 and 90 is because 2 DAI is going towards buying the insurance in the first place. So if something were to happen and the value of DAI or the value of OCDAI were to crater, then you would get about $90 back in terms of ETH. So let's get started. Sign into MetaMask, or we'll connect to MetaMask. And then I haven't mocked up the unlock or enable or approval, so just ignore that for the time being. Let's say I had 500 DAI in this account. These are basically what we would see there. But let's deposit just 100. This was in a better days of gas prices. I made that. Okay, so it's going. Let's say it's done. Hooray. We've deposited 100 DAI. So now we get to manage that. And what does that mean? So we could deposit more if we wanted. We could withdraw if we wanted to get out of there. Or if something were to happen, we could make a claim. And this is basically, a claim is exercise insurance from a user's perspective. So what we're showing you is the actual amount of saveDAI in terms of DAI, but then also in terms of US dollars. The reason we're doing this is so you can know if your saveDAI value has dropped. So if something happens to CDAI, if something happens to DAI, this likely will be something lower. So if this falls below 90, that's the point at which you would want to claim. So let's take a look at that. Basically, these prices are a little bit out of date. So let's say we wanted to claim for, do I have this on here? Yes, I do. If we wanted to claim 100 saveDAI, we could click claim and we would get 0.53 ETH, which is roughly, at the time that I made this, was roughly $90. So I'll click claim. Hooray. Okay, now I'm back to deposit. I'm going to go through that again just so I can show you withdraw. So when I want to withdraw, now here we're seeing the different options that we have. We're still playing around with exactly how this will look, and something we're experimenting with. But if we were going to DAI, we might want to keep it. Oh, my prototype only has exchange. So we're going to exchange the insurance portion for DAI. So this is where we're going to withdraw for underlying asset. That's what we'll be calling in the background here. So we'll go max for 100 and withdraw. And then now we're back to the home. So that's basically it. There's probably some more complex interactions that we need to think about when it comes to renewing or some other things, but we haven't quite gotten there yet. We're starting here. So a question from Brandon: any benefit to creating some sort of contract that auto renews your term? Are there any risks to creating longer and longer insurance terms? So the first one is something we're thinking about, and we'll actually, Ksenia is going to touch on that in a little bit. For the second question, are there any risks to creating longer and longer insurance terms? So Open has played around with a perpetual option, actually, or at least they've been thinking about it. I don't know whether they're going to go that direction. It kind of sounds like they're not. I'm sure there are a number of complexities and nuances involved in that decision. From a user experience perspective, that would be awesome. The longer it is, the easier it is for a user to not have to deal with any renewals or anything like that. They just kind of set it and forget it. If that were the case, we could really get to the point of having a true tokenized, insured, interest-bearing asset that's just an asset and is not really something you have to do much with outside of making a claim if indeed that happens. In today's reality, there are some things around the edges that we need that users have to deal with. One direction we've thought about is making things a little bit easier for them by automating some of that or providing a service that would do that. Let's see, let me get out of here and go back to.
I've got one other quick question, if that's cool.
Yeah, please.
Do you get the same amount back regardless of whether you exercise the insurance like one day into having the insured tokens versus on like February 9th, 2021?
Yeah, so it's basically, so there is an oracle involved in this. So it uses the compound oracle. So that one level of, or one part of, one type of risk that OC-DAI does not cover is the compound oracle risk or oracle issues. But that does mean that what can happen is at any point you can make a claim, exercise your insurance or exercise your option, and get back the amount of the deposit. Basically, your deposit is covered, not any insurance that you would accrue over time.
And quick follow-up question, would it have been possible to make it that way, or is it impossible to make it so that like as you accrue insurance, you top up what you would get back?
I'm not sure. It's something that we've talked about with Open a little bit, and it might be possible, but I'm not sure how much they've put a lot of work into that.
Cool, thanks.
Okay, any other questions before I pass it back to Ksenia? All right.
Okay, so these are, so next steps, and talk about some future ideas. We are pretty much done with the smart contracts. We keep saying that, but then we make little minor tweaks and updates. And there'll probably be some updates to do after we get the audit done. But we are almost done with the smart contracts. We're currently working on the front end. So we're going to complete that. And then, of course, testing. We finally deployed to a test net today, actually, to be able to test some of the functions. Again, audit, and then the goal is to launch in June or July. And that's also kind of contingent on the compound interest price, because right now it's very low, right? So it's like less than 1% at the moment. So there might not be incentive to use saveDAI until that interest increases. So we might hold off until we see that interest going up. Next slide. Okay, and then some ideas that we have for the future that we've talked about. Obviously, saveDAI is very specific to DAI and OC-DAI. And again, it's specific to the OC-DAI that expires in 2021. So we see the potential for building out this kind of token factory where we can pump out different save tokens. So you'd call the create save token, and it would deploy different versions of other versions of saveDAI. So for example, once the current OC-DAI expires, we could pump out or deploy a saveDAI 2020 version using the new OC-DAI contract. We also see it with using USDC, so that's something that we could actually build right now. So the underlying asset that the user would deposit is USDC, and then the CUSDC would be the interest bearing, and the OCUSDC is the insurance portion. And then any other kind of tokens in the future. Right now, Open just provides insurance for OC-DAI and OCUSDC. But as they add more in the future, we could use those, or hypothetically, if there's other kind of protocols that create insurance with ERC20 tokens, there's potential for that. And then next slide. Yeah, and then these are a couple functions Spencer mentioned, and we haven't really fleshed these ideas out, but we see opportunities for a renew function or a mint with renewal. So where the factory would be deploying another version of saveDAI with the new OC-DAI contract, there could also be this renew function that a user calls that kind of does everything automatically for them. So they wouldn't have to like unbundle the current saveDAI, get their DAI back, and then mint new saveDAI tokens with the new OC-DAI tokens. This could be a function that just does that unbundling and purchasing new OC-DAI tokens automatically for them. And then mint with renewal is a function that a user would have the choice to use if they wanted us to handle the renewals for them. So they would, like I said, we haven't flushed these out completely, but they would be giving us approval. So we would keep a lookout for OC-DAI. When that expires, we would basically renew the insurance portion on their saveDAI, and they wouldn't have to worry about anything. So yeah, these are just a couple ideas. If you guys have any that you think would be interesting and want to share, we'd be happy to hear about them. And then next slide, I think this is it. Next slide is just all of our resources. Yeah, so these are all of our links. We've got a website, a web app that's not deployed yet. Is that the front end piece that's currently live?
No, that's actually not. That's just a placeholder for when it does.
Oh, okay. And then GitHub, we have Docs, and then of course our Twitter and Medium.
So right now we haven't announced anything. We haven't like publicly announced that the contract code is open source, but it is. So you can go check out the code on GitHub. Right. The front end is still closed, but at some point we plan on, when it's ready, opening that up.
Yeah, so I think that's all that we have for our presentation.
Yeah.
Very cool. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I say we can get into questions.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to keep asking them in the chat or in our Discord, or feel free to just unmute yourself as well. I've got a couple, but I'll wait and see if anyone else has anything.
Sure. Hi, I'm Peter Smith, calling in from New York. So nice to be at Chicago here. It's a cool thing. I've never been to Chicago.
Hey, Peter. Peter is one of the partners at our company, actually.
So knowing a little bit that you have this bullwhip effect where you've got compound, and then you've got on top of that, or pardon me, you have DAI, and then on top of that you have saveDAI, then you have saveDAI, and then saveDAI, kind of combining the two. When one of the underlying assets has some innovation, saveDAI has some innovation, or saveDAI, does it necessarily mean that saveDAI is obsolete, or is it true that the it's closer to just being in, you know, now there's an opportunity for a new version and the old version remains functional?
What do you mean when you say obsolete? Like the
I guess
saveDAI will have done what saveDAI does already, or like there's a new feature that breaks saveDAI?
maybe a new feature exists and now saveDAI wasn't built to handle it.
That's a good question. I think it probably depends on what the feature is, or set of features would be.
Mm-hmm.
I think as it exists now, there, like all the tokens that we're talking about are ERC20s.
Yep.
So there is a certain, like there are certain standard functions that unless people change, like unless the ERC20 standard kind of falls away, will always be there.
Sure.
I guess if
One
like,
thing, go ahead, continue.
I was gonna say if like, let's say Compound came out with a new version of saveDAI, right? That they would kind of like MakerDAO came out with their new version of DAI, right? It's a different contract address. And that if that were to happen, we would use the factory to kind of mint another, create another saveDAI, or save whatever token ERC20 to use that new contract from saveDAI or saveDAI.
So depending on how you design it, it'll either be writing some new code to handle the new situation, or the factory will be built for the new situation to be handleable in the future. Is that true?
Yeah, I think it's more the latter.
Yeah, cool.
What we would love to be able to do is be able to design the factory in such a way that it could handle multiple different types of tokens. So let's see, what did we have here? So all of these are C tokens, but that doesn't necessarily, that's not a constraint. So C tokens being compound tokens. We're not really constrained to just that. That if we had a different token, like rep, for example, and so say there was a protective put options market for rep from Augur, we wouldn't necessarily have to go through the compound version of that. We could have a self-insured rep, but there just wouldn't be any interest-bearing component of it. You'd have the underlying and the insurance, or the asset and the insurance.
That does open up the question. And you mentioned USDC. There's also Tether. There's other stable coins. And not only that, maybe with each one of them, there's a different version of compound and a different version of what OC is as well. So then is the saveDAI concept, and if it's going to just be the quote unquote save concept, if it's not always related to DAI, it does in some way matters that like USDC is better than DAI for the popularity of this save concept. Is DAI the only one that you can do this on, and that's why you chose DAI? Or is it that DAI is actually better than USDC in your opinion, and that's why you chose DAI?
Probably neither of those two. I wouldn't say DAI is better than USDC. It definitely makes different trade-offs than USDC. To me, those trade-offs are more appealing than USDC. Although, of course, something could happen to DAI. I guess maybe another way to answer that question is there are fewer risks with USDC when it comes to like economic or protocol risks, because there's not a lot of complexity to what's going on with USDC. It's just a deposit minted thing. Obviously, there's like regulatory and like custodial risks with USDC, but probably on balance lower. So maybe there's some more room for, like, there's more risk to DAI to actually insure, which is a reason to cover DAI. I think probably where we're focused originally is just DAI is like the most popular and kind of DeFi native version. If Metacoin ever happens, or I guess it's RAI now, and that goes into Compound, then there wouldn't really be much stopping us from doing that too.
Metacoin? Is that the one that Amin is doing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, that one sounds really cool. And Tether's actually its own. Tether's not ERC20, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is.
Oh, it is?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons our gas prices are insane right now.
Oh, right. Yeah, because there's so much movement of Tether.
Yeah. So I guess that, like this one thing. Sorry, Paul, but I think an important distinction is between saveDAI, the user-facing product, and saveDAI, the kind of protocol-ish kind of concept. Obviously, they're one and the same right now, but we see them very differently in the future, where the factory that enables this like save token concept or this self-insured asset concept definitely would support a proliferation of more saveDAI type things and support the next version of saveDAI or the next kind of next term of insurance, et cetera. But also could be used to create any number of self-insured assets so long as there is a token that represents insurance for that asset. So we're thinking about that as a longer term version of or niche for this concept of saveDAI.
Quick question I had. I noticed that a lot of the main methods for the contracts were external rather than public. I was wondering if that was like, if that choice was made for any specific reasons.
Yeah, I can speak to that briefly. So the idea is that saveDAI can be a Lego block, right? So other people can utilize it for other dApps and whatnot. So we actually have the saveDAI interface, which our contracts inheriting from. So just by the spec, we're required to make those external. But the reality is, like, the only ones that are interfacing with those functions are external individuals, whether it's message sender or another contract. Never within our own contract are we utilizing those functions in particular. So there's no need to make it public. They're just always utilized by external transactions.
Cool, makes sense. And then one idea I guess I had is, have you looked at all at the OpenZeppelin message sender implementation that lets you use either meta transactions or standard transactions? I bring that up because message.sender is used in a few spots.
Oh, is that like the context contract?
I don't think it's the context one, is it? It's for meta transactions, right? So like we are subsidizing gas fees essentially.
Yeah, you or someone.
Right. Yeah, that's it. We haven't really talked about that, but it's definitely worth giving more thought to.
I think there are a number of things like that. Maybe like a newer ERC 777 with additional functionality. Maybe things like that. I think all of that, we're sort of, whether we've explicitly talked about it or we've like one of us has had the idea, we're kind of waiting for the point at which we get to the factory to think more thoroughly about that.
Yeah, we're kind of in the mode, let's build it fast and get it out there, and then like worry about the longer term.
Fast.
Yeah, right, fast. Yeah, we thought we could get it out this month, and that's definitely not happening. But yeah, I think for some of the more intricate, like, so this notion of using meta transactions, which I think could be a really compelling idea, and it's definitely worth giving more thought to. It just might be a little bit further down the road. I think right now we're kind of trading off, expedience to get this thing out there versus like comprehensive functionality.
Another consideration is that there are like user wallet services that exist that kind of take care of that already without us having to do anything. I think there's a lot of value to us supporting that directly, but things like Ethereum or I guess on the mobile side or Wallet Connect side, well, I guess they don't really do. Okay, just Ethereum is the one main one I'm thinking about. And Web3 modal and similar things like that make it super, super easy to just support pretty much any user wallet service that's out there. So it's pretty easy for us to do that.
Does anyone else have any other questions?
I have a question for myself, I guess, or like something interesting that we didn't really touch on too much, but I think is interesting to talk about. We sort of hinted at it a little bit. Let's see if I can go back in a few slides and show you what I'm talking about. Yeah, okay. So let's try this pointer thing. Can you guys see what I'm doing here? Oh gosh. Yeah. So these couple require statements, what's important is not really the require statements themselves, but just the concept that we are trying to make sure that we have equivalence between the amount of the asset, so the saveDAI token, and the amount of saveDAI tokens ultimately that we are minting, and the amount of O tokens for the OCDAI that we have. So this is an interesting relationship that you might see other wrapper function wrapper tokens out there, and a lot of them will have mappings so that they can keep track of balances, which is obviously is what they need to do. But because there is a relationship between a unit relationship between, let's see, between OCDAI and DAI, where one OCDAI protects one DAI and all decimals on down. It actually allows us to forego those mappings altogether, as long as we maintain that relationship maintain the amount equivalence between the two, and also mint the same number of saveDAI tokens. So that does mean a couple things. It does mean that saveDAI tokens are denominated in CDAI units. So it's not quite as easy for users to think about as like one DAI, for example. So we're having to do a couple things on the front end to account for that. But it does help on the contract to keep things much simpler, and probably helps with keeping gas at a reasonable level as well. There's something else that I had in mind too, but I forgot it. So I'll just leave it there.
Well, if there aren't any other questions, thanks.
The insurance, it breaks as of Feb 10, 2021. Then that's Feb 10, 2021 determined by the makers of OCDAI. Was it that they set a year term on that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
that's right.
So as the makers of OCDAI want to set up more insurance, are they currently doing that? Is there currently another different contract that would expire in June of 2021, or anything with a flexible term? Are there other existing alternatives today?
Not today. However, we anticipate that happening. and anybody in theory could go today and create one. Open is a permissionless protocol. So they have made some very deliberate decisions behind what they themselves are minting and creating markets for, but that doesn't prevent anybody else from doing the same thing with any parameters that they'd like.
Understood.
So Iron, or I guess the Curve team, has actually created their own version. So that's not something we've talked about at all here, but that's another possibility for something to include or to mint via the factory at the point when we get to there.
So I could be clear about it. That would be that team creating something more similar to saveDAI.
Yeah, it's called OCRV.
Okay.
Is the token that they created.